Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 15th of October, and today our main focus will be on the Velyka Novosilka sector. I want to go through the advances over the past 24 hours here, as corroborated also by Ukrainian sources. I want to look at the order of battle, both for the Russian and Ukrainian side, so you guys get an idea of the huge disparity, both in the quality and quantity of the forces on each side. And I also want to look at topography and the trenches in that region, because you can see an uptick in Russian advances occurring in really interesting areas over the past week or so. So we're going to zoom in here and you'll see that in yellow, these are Russian advances from these past 24 hours. I'll just begin by looking at the minutia and then we'll talk about the bigger picture. So here west of Zolota Niva, you have reports from Ukrainian side of further advances north of Novodonetsk and west of Zolota Niva, amounting to, 5 square kilometers. Again, continued advances utilizing the vast open areas that are not fortified by any means, so the Ukrainians don't have any ability to really dig in and push back against infantry-based advances, but also there are large armored assaults that are needed in order to overrun Ukrainian forward posts. That's what happened in Zolota Niva, and it's probably not what is going on at the moment with these advances through open fields, because it's just too risky to go out with bulky equipment, and that's how you get exposed essentially. So smaller squads are involved with advances through tree lines, and that's how you see the fields in between also being taken over. Now this region over here that I'm marking it with an X, it's really important because it's a ridge, a local ridge that is running south of the highway that leads directly into Velyka Novosilka. This ridge is partially under Russian control, especially areas that are just south of Prechestivka over here in X, and all that is being utilized to overlook and bombard the Mokriali River Valley and the areas that the Ukrainians currently control, including Makarivka, Storozheve, and Oskuchnia, and various other suburbs of Novosilka. So it's even more important for the Ukrainians to salvage whatever heights they do still have remaining near the line of contact. And what they do have left would be this small piece of area over here. This region is difficult to hold on to because, again, you don't have a large density of forces. A lot of the forces that are here are really focused on actual fighting in villages or attacks going on westwards, or in building up where they actually do have trenches further north in the city itself, or in the horizontal trenches that you see over here protecting Shakhtarsk as well. Everything that's south of it, though, it's really in a precarious situation because you can see that the Russians already have momentum advancing in this sort of 6 kilometer long region, and the structure is already there due to the highway, due to Velyka Novosilka being in a really low elevated valley juxtaposed to where the Russians are currently advancing through. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. As we move westward, though, the Russians have also launched attacks here that I talked about in my previous video about the possibility of Levadne being captured because Russian sources discussed it. I don't think the Russian MOD claimed it explicitly, but you did have a lot of prominent Russian sources talking about it. And now you have Deep State actually going out and showing Russian advances, not in Levadne itself, which I don't think is important on its own. It really is just a hamlet with a couple of agricultural buildings. But just to the east, you have the capture of 6.2 square kilometers. This is really important in the sense that now you have finally substantial changes after over a year of just total stalemate in this front, with the Ukrainians being located more or less north of Pryutny, especially along this particular ravine and the ponds nearby. And there was an effort during the counteroffensive to sort of trickle their way in along these various tree lines into the northwestern outskirts of Pryutny. That's something that the Ukrainian troops tried to do in a staggered attempt, but really the attacks fizzled out and the Russian forces were able to maintain their forward outpost here. And in retrospect, that was really important because Pryutny, it serves as this forward Russian stepping stone to begin attacks along this sort of semicircular salient almost that is sticking out over here, and allows the Russians to then branch out into individual Ukrainian positions. And so that's what they're doing, and now they're beginning to reach the ravine region that served as a Ukrainian local strong point for over a year, and in the process also flanking whatever small Ukrainian squad is still around Levadne. Also to the north, there's Novodarivka, and it appears that they're just horizontally south of it attacking. So you can see it's only about 2.8 kilometers away from the current line of contact. Now, for to look at the garrisons for both sides, the Ukrainians here, they've had over a year of just continual downgrades in the amount of forces, but also the quality. So to zoom in, we'll go through each unit here. You have the 13th SBU detachment, just a very small force that is really added on for ancillary purposes. Then you have here two National Guard brigades that were only recently, over the past half year, created: the 31st National Guard Operational Brigade and then the 17th. I believe the 17th used to be called the 32nd National Guard Regiment. It was upgraded from a regiment to a brigade, and I'm not sure if that's because they actually received the proper amount of forces to really reach that 2,000 plus number of troops for a brigade, or if it was just an increase in staffing and just a change in the name so they could be more readily moved in and then on paper be operating in a certain region to fill gaps. I don't know which one is true, but you have the same case for the 31st because it used to be called the 16th Regiment and it was also upgraded. So I'm really not confident in actually, in my estimates, saying that these forces are at full strength, but they were moved over here definitely to fill voids because other more experienced and troops that actually were closer to full strength were moved away. They were moved away over a year ago because you had the four Marine brigades moved to Kherson. A lot of those brigades have either been moved to Kursk or to the Volchansk region ever since. You also have movement of certain battalions of the Separate Presidential Brigade, really important Ukrainian brigade that is having its battalions totally split up between various sectors. So that brigade, some of its elements were moved away from the sector. Although two battalions of that unit are still around, you have the 3rd Battalion, and attached to them is the Luftwaffe drone group, which is operating around here. I know here you have the 20th Special Purpose Battalion. So those are two elements, several hundred each. So you could add that together. And if you're really going on the maximum side, then you could estimate 1,000 between both of them combined. You also have the 128th Dnipro Territorial Defense Brigade. Again, TDF units, not really the cream of the crop. And then you have 58th Motorized Brigade, not even mechanized. Motorized, meaning it has this sort of intermediary level of equipment, not large amounts of infantry fighting vehicles or tanks, but something in between that. And what you have in an infantry brigade, which would be something like vehicles, trucks. So then it's not that strong in terms of its capacity. It was really taken out for a long time throughout all of 2023 and was basically a rebuild from the bottom up. So yeah, it is a totally new unit in that regard. And over the past year, it's been stationed fighting in Velyka Novosilka sector and then to the east. They were supposed to hold on to Zolota Niva and also Prachestivka, and were pushed back in really quick succession and were unable to stabilize the situation there. Even today, they've been unable to. So in terms of their combat experience and track record since their new iteration, it really hasn't been that good. And some of it is also not their fault because they're not really receiving any support from outside units. There are some battalions of artillery brigades that are here to support, but it's much more diminished than what it was a couple of months ago when there may have still been a strong artillery garrison here. A lot of it is more focused on the Volkodar region. And so, 58th bears the brunt of a lot of the Russian advances in this particular region. And they're also a part of the total calculation for how many forces there are over here, which I would estimate to be roughly 7.5 thousand men. Again, when you're looking at an entire sector and comparing it to other areas like Toretsk, Pokrovsk, Saidove, you're looking at it, it's really not comparable. And it's also probably a similar amount of width in terms of the front line. And that should show you that it is a lower priority because clearly the Ukrainians needed those forces elsewhere, either directly or, through diverting troops away from one region and then moving them into Pokrovsk, for instance. So what I mean is that you had forces slated for Donetsk moved to Kursk recently, August. And in order to fill the void left in those regions in Donetsk, you had forces that were located in Velyka Novosilka moved away. And so it's just this sort of cascading effect of moving around and not having sufficient forces. And the best example of that is the 142nd Infantry Brigade. That's a new unit that was created this year. And they were first fighting here. They had a track record and I had marked on my map. But recently, I've seen social media posts from at least two of their battalions indicating they're actually fighting in Pokrovsk. And that's definitely because forces were needed to stabilize. And they're doing so with several other brigades, at least two other brigades that were created in the 150 series, which are brigades, again, created this year earlier. And so you could see how they were really moved in to help closed lines, but then the effect of that is that you don't have as many troops here located to stop the sort of advances that we're seeing by the Russian side. Then looking at the Russian order of battle, it's mainly units from the 127th Division, although there are some other brigades that you could really click on my map, which is linked in my description all the time. So I'm not going to go through each one because it's not that interesting. You have the names for them if you want, but it's probably around 6 regiments, could be a bit higher depending on how many territorial motoreth regiments really are still stationed here after, there were records of them like half a year ago, even more operating here. Like there's just not enough of a paper trail to like indicate that there was a continued presence after such a long period of time. There are also at least 3 brigades, the most notable of which is the 336th Naval Infantry Brigade, because first of all, they're not a part of the 127th Division, and they've also been reported as the unit involved with the recent advance marked in yellow per Deep State's reporting. Then also at least 1 reconnaissance battalions operating around here. So just based on adding up the numbers, I think it's probably around 24.5 thousand. So then you're looking at nearly a 4-to-1 advantage for the Russian side, which is more than enough to conduct offensive operations in this specific area. And then when you look at it, a huge chunk of the Ukrainian garrison here is made up of units that aren't even a part of the AFU, National Guard elements, or territorial defense elements, or just ancillary units. You have a support unit here, this transport service element. So it's really a hodgepodge of forces that are not the best and most conducive for the defensive fighting. So I will be interested to see if Ukraine decides to make some sort of shift in their troop rotations in order to ensure that the forces here are a bit more strong. And that could be done by moving some forces away from, the Huli-Ipoli axis, because there are some battalions here that aren't really engaged in frontline combat. You also have the Orkiv sector, for instance, so they may have to end up opting for that. Now, to look at where the Russians are advancing and why it's important, you have to realize the local topography. So just west of Velyka Novosilka, you have this massive ridge. This ridge I'm marking it with an X, and then it extends to the northwest, sort of like this. The regions that are in lower elevation, I suppose I'll mark them in green for you guys. You could see how it's just completely dominated by regions that the Russians are either taking or plan to take in the future. You also have this sort of green low elevation running along this river valley north of where the Russians are currently attacking, and the Russians are trying to establish themselves in that ravine because it gives access, and you're able to advance to those regions with some sort of foliage protection. You have ridges located south in regions that the Russians currently control in Prutny, for instance. So basically just on the western side of this sort of salient bulge west of Storm Lenivka over here. And more generally, if we're to look at it, you can see that a huge part of the hinterlands between the main Zaporozhye and main Donetsk axes is in this region west of the Velyka Novosilka sector. I'm going to mark it with these 2 red lines. This region, it's dense in trenches, not as much in manpower, but there are some important logistics centers, a lot of key road hubs in this area, a lot of it centering around Uspenivka, because then from there it branches off into several areas where there actually is battlefield contact. You could see it on the map over here. So it is really essential for the Ukrainians as a fabric that then branches out. So definitely the Russians are going to make an effort to attack towards it. And I believe the best way to do it would not be doing so head on. It would be through advancing to the east, advancing along the open areas that are near Velyka Novosilka. In those highly elevated areas, it will provide the perfect launch pad to fire an attack towards Velyka Novosilka itself, and then also the opportunity to break through the trench lines in an area that looks to be relatively weak and advance from there. And then you're looking at a more long-term operation, and also probably would require a lot of the reserves in the region to be activated for that attack. But definitely it is possible given the state of the Ukrainian forces, both in the city itself and also in regions to the west of it. And then you would have potentially the eastern flank of Uspenivka and the nearby trenches being compromised as a result. And just remember, all those regions that are in between those 2 red lines that I marked, all the villages, the chains of villages and the roads are all located on really low elevation in comparison to the X's that I marked previously in the regions the Russians are trying to take over. So I do think that is definitely an interesting possibility. There's also the possibility of the Russians just continuing northwards following the capture of Velyka Novosilka to accrue additional control over the chain of villages running along this river valley, which runs along the Mokriali River region. It reaches areas like Komar, which is an important sort of logistics hub, And all of it is a part of a wider network of the connection between Dnipro, Donetsk, and Zaporozhye Oblast, which is very important for supplying the current Ukrainian garrisons in southern Donetsk. Now, looking at Kharkiv, we have once again a very marginal advance, really close to the Oskil River. Let's actually measure the distance because it is so close, about 2.3 kilometers away. At the nearest distance, it's only 1.75 kilometers. Really significant when you look at it because this is where the fighting has been concentrated in this very narrow pass of territory, and that's where the Ukrainians are concentrating their fire. Mainly the 1st Boravy Brigade, which is a part of the National Guard. They're involved with the defensive activities here. They published footage, which is a compilation of their work over the past 5 days or six between the 9th and the 14th, up to today, which would be 6 days later. And one of the incidents shows their tank firing towards Russian positions in eastern Kolsnikivka, for the first time confirming Russian boots on the ground in the houses themselves, which means the Russians are now making the preparations for storming this really important buffer settlement between where the Russians are and the river itself, and also just north of Kruklyakivka, which is, of course, also in Russia's crosshairs. So it is important to note the Ukrainians are still really active in their defense here, no intention of leaving without a fight. So they did show numerous incidents of either artillery or drone strikes targeting individual Russian soldiers or dugouts, or destroying a BM-21 Grad, for instance, targeting vans, tanks, etc. over that 5-day period. And then just straight from the brigade itself, they claim that the Russian forces lost 121 men in 5 days alone due to their actions. Now, if you're dividing that and then you're also taking into account what is probably 3-to-1 killed wounded ratio, then it will probably be around 8 Russian soldiers killed daily in this one very narrow section. Now, I'm not the arbiter of truth or understand enough to say with definitive certainty if that's true or not, so I'll let you guys decide that for yourselves. But regardless of that, the Russians are, of course, inching closer in this region, mainly doing so on foot, but there's also, under the guise of tanks, a lot of tank divisions are located in this area and are providing supports along the route, this very deep route of salients from Pischane all the way to where the Oskil River currently is. Now, moving on to the Volchansk front, and you could actually say the border between Kharkiv and Belgorod. This is interesting. We have proof of the Ukrainians actually crossing over very marginally into Russian territory, and it's just northwest of the Hliboke, or whatever you want to call it, Liptsi, for instance, sector. You could see that it's near the village of Jurovlevka, sorry. And you can see here the geolocation from October 2015 of the 29th Artillery Regiment. This Russian force, they've conducted MLRS shelling of the forested area, clearly indicating, because of the mass bombardment, just a huge amount of artillery strikes on this one concentrated region, there was definitely a suspicion of Ukrainian forces being located here, and definitely with the intention of storming, or at the very least raiding with DRGs, the Russian positions in this particular village. Then on the same day, you had the Ukrainians with their own attacks. As the Russians were moving in reinforcements to this region, they organized artillery strikes, and also drones dropped grenades onto individual Russian soldiers that had dismounted within the village itself. There were also these local trenches or dugouts built on the perimeter that were struck by them. There was also at least one BMP destroyed due to the efforts of the 3rd Brigade. This 3rd Spartan National Guard Brigade is located here in the Lipsy sector. They've been involved in a lot of the fighting, for instance, in Hliboke. So it's not that big of a stretch to then say that a certain detachment of theirs was moved to here and is involved with, for now, it's very small scale clashes, but it is, compared to what it was last week and over the past few months, totally, I suppose, out of the ordinary to see clashes in this one area. And we can't really draw any massive conclusions, besides the fact that maybe if it were to go on, it would be an indication that the Ukrainians are trying to divert forces and focus away from the fighting that is occurring within their own territory in the Kharkiv Liptsi sector itself. Now, looking at the Kursk fronts, not as many changes. Again, a lot of the situation is not fully clarified specifically in the region, just to the north of Lyubomovka, around Nogovka, Kremyannoy, where again there probably are still Ukrainian squads engaged in fluid movements. They're not staying in one spot, but they're still trying to meander in this general sector that I suppose spans even 10 kilometers, and at the closest is about 3-4 kilometers away from Kuranovo itself at this point. But over time, the mantle really will continue to shift, and you'll see it peter away. For instance, the 82nd Brigade, they've been really active around here recently, conducting raids and trying to repel sort of the forward-most advances of the Russians. And that would be in areas like Pogrebki, but also along the highway and Novo Ivanovka itself, where the Ukrainians claim they have been able to conduct localized counterattacks and sort of stabilize the line around that specific village. Although for now it remains a gray zone. You also have footage of a Ukrainian repulsion of an attack towards the region either of Cherkasskaya, Konopelka, or Kolmakov. So you can see this is from October 15th. It's from the 61st Mechanized Brigade, and that's important. This is a unit that previously was imagined to be defending in the Vuhledar area, just northeast of it, around that like large open field region, also just south of the chain of villages, including what's it called, Katerianivka. And here you can see the icon on the map. It's a very good force in the sense that it hasn't had that much time to be attrited after being moved to the Vuhledar region, because it was not really at center stage in a lot of those defensive activities. So now it's going to be moved over here, where it will continue to fulfill those defensive actions. So it's, probably 1,000, 2,000 men being moved into this region now, which will just further bolster Suja's southern flank, because as you know, I've talked about how the Ukrainian garrison is rather strong, at least on paper, in the western part of the Kursk axis, where you have two air assault brigades that are really strong. You have the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade. You actually have the 104th TDF. I moved them today, but they were moved in September, I believe. And the 104th TDF, back to my earlier point, it was operating near the Velyka Novosilka fronts. So that's another unit that was moved away from that specific region. So you do have some density over here, and that's also the region where the Russians broke through. Now, if they were to concentrate a lot of their focus over here south of the Suja region, that could be really, really dangerous. And that's why the Ukrainians are aware of that and have put in additional manpower. You also have the 129th TDF Brigade with a lot of experience from Avdiivka, for instance, and Pokrovsk. So they're also defending in this region, and they're conducting these rear artillery strikes onto Russian forces in Gry, Krupets, Ozerki, wherever it is. And then to get back to the video that I was talking about, you can see that at least 2 out of 4 Russian BMPs that were trying to advance were destroyed due to the 61st Brigade. They tried reaching this specific tree line to dismount 25 men, and it was broken up before they were successful, but it does show how now the vehicles are comfortable advancing through this region. The goal would be to eventually cut off this road over here to reach this paved route, which leads directly into the southern parts of eastern Suja. Also would help repel any sort of Ukrainian presence in Ruskaya Konopelka, because the Ukrainians here, they have this forward outcropping, which is not really in line with the current front line, so it is an exposed region. And taking full control of it back for the Russians would give them this forward outpost to then begin their own attacks onto eastern perimeter of Suja and Agronom, Bondarivka, Mirny. All these regions would once again be within relatively close firing range for the Russian forces. So you can see how the battlefield is being shaped in that way. But for now, just no major changes, just troop movements. And while we're on the topic of troop movements, you have the 225th Assault Battalion. It's an independent unit, rather strong. It was really beefed up in order to be utilized during the Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians. It did have a track record of fighting in areas like Olgovka, Kremyanoy, then was moved about 3 weeks ago to the Glushkovo district to, help out with the assaults over there. It seems like those ones are either not really active anymore or were actually completely repelled. And I'm waiting for a lot of evidence to come out, because I'm relatively confident that probably the Ukrainians have scaled down a lot, if not all, of their operations in the Glushkovo area, but I don't have proof pointing in that direction, just claims by the Russian side. But now in terms of further indications, you have the 225th Battalion being moved back from the Glushkovo area to Kursk. So now they're going to be involved with the defense in the western sector, where you had the initial Russian breakthrough, which reached an area like Zeleny Shulaich, where we don't yet have confirmation of a Ukrainian counterattack. What we do know is that there's footage coming out from the Russian side where they showed a Ukrainian platoon of 30 men withdrawing across the Snagost River. They withdrew from positions in Tolsty Lug and made it to Darino, which is now going to be their sort of organizing point, and they're going to use the natural body of water to prevent deeper Russian advances. This is pretty good proof, I would say, that Tolsty Lug and Pokrovsky are about to, if not are already in the gray zone. And then we're going to have to wait for proof of the Russians moving in from Lyubimovka, where we know they have a presence further southwards, to assert themselves. And that will help expand the relatively narrow salient the Russians have created into a more formidable force that could attack in several directions, including along this highway towards Verdlikovo, and then also deeper into the rear of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk itself. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.